The Vaethori called them Stonewarden formations. That was the official designation in the survey manifest. Class 2 geological anomalies, inert, of academic interest due to their unusual bilateral symmetry and apparent accelerated mineralization patterns. The manifest was 47 pages long. I read it on the transport out. I also read the 9-page addendum the Vaethori Research Consortium had appended, which detailed the formation's composition, their estimated age of 400,000 years, their distribution across the northern continent of Carath 9, and their complete harmlessness. I read that addendum twice. Then I put the manifest down and looked out the transport window at the dark between stars, and I thought about the valley behind my grandmother's house on Vale Prime, and the way the stones there had the same bilateral symmetry, and the way nobody in our village had ever, not once in 4 generations of living beside them, turned their back on them. My grandmother called them the Watchers. She never explained why. She didn't need to. I should tell you who I was at that point. 26 years old. Junior Xenobiological Survey Liaison, Grade 3, seconded from the Earth Reclamation Authority to the Vaethori Research Consortium under the Joint Species Survey Agreement that had been in effect for 11 years. My job, technically, was to provide a human physiological perspective on alien biological specimens, to flag anything that might interact unexpectedly with human biochemistry, and to file the appropriate Earthside reports at the end of each mission. That was the job description. The real reason the Vaethori brought human liaisons along on their survey missions was because we were cheap to insure and they were required to by the treaty. None of the Vaethori on the Carath 9 team had ever worked with a human before. There were 9 of them. Dr. Orethveen was the expedition lead, 4-armed, pale gray plated skin, the particular kind of academic confidence that comes from 40 years of being correct in rooms where nobody argues back. He had 4 published volumes on geological anomaly classification, and had, in his own words, personally catalogued more inert formation sites than any living researcher in the consortium's history. He said this on the first day of transit, over the shared meal table, while his 3 primary researchers nodded with the comfortable agreement of people who have heard a thing many times and stopped questioning it. The other 5 were junior researchers, graduate level, each assigned to a specific measurement discipline. They were polite to me, careful, even the way people are careful around something they don't fully understand but have been told is not dangerous. I ate my food and listened, and said very little. It took 6 days to reach Carath 9. The planet read cold on the approach, mean surface temperature of 4 degrees, thin atmosphere, high mineral content in the soil, no detectable microbial life in the surveys. The formations were scattered across a valley basin approximately 40 kilometers wide, seated on a flat gray plain under a sky the color of old iron. They ranged in height from 1 meter to perhaps 12. They were the color of basalt. They had the bilateral symmetry the manifest described, 2 projecting masses that, if you let your mind work loosely, might suggest outstretched arms, and they were covered in the fine fracture patterns of very old stone. From the shuttle, they looked like a graveyard. I said that out loud once to Dr. Orethveen's junior researcher Sethik Poth, who was standing beside me at the observation port as we descended. Sethik Poth had 4 arms like the rest of his species, and a pair of secondary manipulators that he used for delicate work, and he had a habit of folding all 6 limbs close to his body when he was concentrating. He looked at the formations below us, and said, with genuine academic enthusiasm, that the bilateral patterning did have a certain anthropomorphic quality, which was itself interesting from a convergent evolution standpoint, though of course the formations had no biological component whatsoever. I said, they look like a graveyard to me. He said, that's a very earth-patterned interpretive response. I said, yes. He went back to his equipment. We landed at the eastern edge of the valley basin, 3 kilometers from the nearest formation cluster. The base camp was 6 modular habitat units, a central lab tent, a sensor array, and a power generator that hummed at a frequency that I could feel in my back teeth. Standard survey kit. The Vaethori moved with the practiced efficiency of a team that had done this dozens of times, unpacking, calibrating, establishing the sensor perimeter, logging the first atmospheric readings. By the time the sun, a pale, distant thing, more white than yellow, had moved an hour further across the iron sky, the camp was functional, and Dr. Orethveen was standing at the edge of the sensor array's coverage radius, looking out at the formations with his primary arms clasped behind his back. I walked up beside him. He said, "We'll begin approach surveys tomorrow. The remote instruments will run overnight." He said it the way a man announces a schedule, not the way a man asks a question. I said, "I'd like to establish one protocol before we start." He looked at me. He had large, laterally set eyes, the pale amber of old glass, and the particular slight widening that passed for polite attention in his species. He said, "Of course." I said, "Nobody turns their back on the formations. At any point, during approach surveys, during sample collection, during any unstructured time in the valley, if you're moving past a formation, you face it. If you need to move away from a formation, you go backwards so you're always facing it. I know it sounds unusual, and I know the manifest says they're inert. I'm asking you to do it anyway." He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of long moment that contains a lot of decisions being made and then revised. He said, "The remote sensor data shows no movement in the formations over the 8 months of pre-survey monitoring. They are geological features. We observe basic xenobiological caution as standard maintaining distance during initial surveys, appropriate PPE atmospheric testing before direct contact. But the specific protocol you're describing," he paused, "it would be operationally inconvenient." I said, "I understand." He said, "Is there something in the Earth Authority's data on this planet that suggests a specific hazard?" I said, "Earth hasn't surveyed this planet. We don't have data on it." He said, "Then what is your concern based on?" I said, "Pattern recognition." He looked at the formations. He looked at me. He said, not unkindly, that he would note my concern in the expedition log and that the team would observe standard caution protocols. Then he walked back toward the lab tent. I stood there a while longer, looking out at the nearest formation cluster. The closest one was perhaps 800 meters away. It was a medium-height specimen, maybe 4 meters, with the bilateral projection pattern, the fractured gray surface, the absolute stillness. From this distance, in this light, it looked exactly like a thing that had not moved in 400,000 years. I watched it until the sun finished its descent, and the iron sky went dark. Then I went to my habitat unit, and set a light to stay on all night, and did not sleep much. The first week went without incident, which I expected. The Vaethori were methodical researchers, and their initial approach surveys were slow, careful distance maintenance, instrument readings, photographic cataloging, ground sample collection from the basin floor at safe removed from the formations. Dr. Orethveen was meticulous in the way that brilliant, careful scientists are meticulous, and I had enough professional respect for his process to stay out of it. I followed the team during their survey walks. I kept my face toward the formations. I did not say anything when the Vaethori researchers turned to compare instrument readings with each other, or crouched to collect samples with their backs to the valley, because I had said my piece and been noted, and that was the position I was in. I watched the formations. In 8 days of approach surveys, none of them moved. The remote sensors logged nothing. The overnight readings were flat lines. Dr. Orethveen showed me the data on the 4th day. Not unkindly, the screens showing 8 months of pre-survey monitoring, plus our own 4 days of on-site data, every formation stationary within the measurement tolerance of their instruments. He said, "You seem to be watching for something specific." I said, "I always watch for something specific." He said, "What is it?" I said, "I'll tell you if I see it." He accepted this with the equanimity of a man who has learned that certain types of humans have a certain type of stubbornness, and that engaging it directly is rarely productive. On the 9th day, Sethekpoth found a stone fragment inside the camp perimeter. It was small fist-sized, basalt-colored, with the same fine fracture pattern as the formations. He brought it to Dr. Orethveen, who examined it and said it had likely been dislodged by last night's wind event and blown into camp. There had been wind last night, 14 kilometers per hour from the northwest. The nearest formation cluster was to the southwest. I did not say anything. I took a photograph of the fragment and logged it in my own field notes with a timestamp and the wind direction. That night I moved my sleep schedule. The Vaethori slept in 2 shifts, 4 resting while 5 maintained camp and instruments, cycling through. I stopped sleeping at night entirely. I told Dr. Orethveen that my circadian preferences ran to daylight sleep, and that I'd take the overnight observation shift, which would free one of his junior researchers for more instrument time during survey hours. He agreed readily. Humans were known to have idiosyncratic sleep schedules. It fit the profile he had of us, adaptive, slightly odd, ultimately manageable. I sat outside my habitat unit each night in a folding chair with a lamp turned on, and my face toward the valley. The first few nights of solo watching were quiet in a way that required effort to maintain. There is a particular discipline in watching something you cannot see. The formations were invisible past 30 meters in the dark, present only as shapes the eye tried to resolve from the texture of the gray air. I kept my lamp on and I faced the valley and I counted the formations I could see at dawn, and I waited. The discipline was not thinking about what it would feel like to fall asleep in that chair. The lamp would stay on whether I was awake or not. The question was whether my eyes would close. They did not close. On the 3rd night I ate cold rations in my chair and watched a Vaethori junior researcher move between the habitat units without looking at the valley. He was tired, end of a long instrument day, moving from his unit to the latrine and back, head down, lamp off, and I watched the nearest formation cluster and nothing happened, nothing moved, because the sensor array was active and its sweeps were covering the cluster at 90-second intervals. The sensor array counted as observation. I had already worked that out and confirmed it in the first 2 nights, but it was useful to watch him move in the dark without looking, and to note that nothing happened, and to sit with the understanding that the sensors were doing the work he didn't know needed doing. On the 7th night I had a moment, around 3 in the morning by my internal clock, when the cold went deep into my joints, and my body began the particular negotiation it makes at that hour, the pulling down, the slowing, and I stood up from my chair and walked a slow perimeter of the camp rather than sit still and lose the argument. Walking helped. I had done this in my grandmother's valley as a child, on the nights she let me keep her company at the window. When you get tired, you move, because moving keeps the blood going and the eyes forward and the mind present. You don't stop watching. You change positions. I walked the perimeter facing outward for 20 minutes and then sat back down. They did not close. On the 11th night, I counted 17 formations in the nearest cluster. The pre-survey manifest had catalogued 15. I did not record this in the expedition log. I recorded it in my own field notes precisely, with the timestamp and my sightline angles and the instrument readings from the sensor array for that hour. The sensor array showed nothing, no movement, no thermal signature, no acoustic event. I looked at those readings for a long time. Then I looked at the formation cluster. 17. The 2 that were new, or rather, the 2 that were now closer, were positioned at the eastern edge of the cluster, the edge nearest camp. I did not go back to sleep. I sat in my chair with my lamp on and watched until the pale sun came up, and when it did I stayed in my chair a while longer, feeling the cold settle into my back and the particular alertness of a body that has gone past tired into something harder and quieter. Then I stood up and went inside and made myself something warm to drink, and sat at my small table and wrote out the count again, methodically, and looked at the numbers until they stopped feeling like a mistake. They were not a mistake. In the morning, I asked Dr. Orethveen if I could review the full historical imagery archive from the pre-survey monitoring period. He said yes and gave me access without much thought. It was a large data set, thousands of still images taken at 6-hour intervals across 8 months, and he had reviewed the motion differential summary, which had shown nothing. Going through the raw images manually was the kind of task a junior liaison would be given if the senior researcher wanted to keep her occupied. I spent 3 days going through them. I ate at my workstation and checked my clock for when the overnight shift started and went out to my chair and came back in with the dawn and kept working. The junior researchers who passed my station occasionally paused to look at what I was doing, that many images, that much time, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to someone who was doing a tedious task thoroughly. Thoroughness in tedious tasks is its own explanation. There was no motion differential in the summary because the analysis algorithm had been calibrated to flag movements above a threshold of 2 centimeters per 6-hour interval. The formations moved less than 2 centimeters per 6-hour interval. In 8 months of images, each advancing in increments that fell just below the detection threshold, sometimes 1.7 centimeters, sometimes 1.4, once as little as 0.8, the nearest formation cluster had moved 31 meters toward the site of the survey landers. The survey landers that had been doing pre-survey instrument drops since the monitoring began. The landers that emitted light and heat and acoustic vibration. I sat with that data for a while. The math was straightforward, and I did it 3 times to be certain. 31 meters in 8 months, directed consistently toward the nearest heat source, in increments precisely calibrated to avoid the detection threshold of the monitoring instruments. Not random geological drift. Not atmospheric movement, deliberate subthreshold advance toward a target. Then I wrote a very precise note in my field journal and put a date on it and went to find Dr. Orethveen. He was in the lab tent reviewing the spectroscopic analysis of the valley basin soil, which had some unusual mineral composition he found interesting. He had his secondary manipulators spread across 3 different instrument readouts and was cross-referencing them with the focused attention of someone in the middle of a thought. I stood in the tent entrance until he reached a natural pause, and then I said his name, and he looked up. I said, "I need 15 minutes." He gave me 15 minutes. I showed him the image archive analysis. I showed him the movement calculations, the subthreshold increments, the cumulative displacement, the directional consistency. I showed him the new count from 11 nights ago and my own sightline measurements. I said the formations are not geological. I said they move toward heat and light sources when not under direct observation. I said the sensor array doesn't detect them because they stop when the sensors are active. They stop when anything is watching them. I said the 2 closest formations are now approximately 600 meters from the camp perimeter. He looked at my data for a long time. He was a thorough man. He checked my image selection methodology and my measurement calculations and the sightline geometry 3 times each. He did not dismiss it. He sat with it, which I respected. Then he said, "The pre-survey remote instruments include a full-spectrum continuous monitoring array. Motion, thermal, acoustic. The formations have shown no response to these instruments throughout the monitoring period." I said, "No, they showed no response above the detection threshold. That's different." He said, "The threshold is calibrated to detect any movement by a biological organism of meaningful size." I said, "Right, it's calibrated for things that need to move fast. These don't." He said, You're suggesting an organism with sufficient environmental awareness to detect when it's being monitored and cease movement accordingly. I said, I'm suggesting the evidence supports that interpretation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, do you know what the implications of that would be for the classification of this planetary body? I said, yes. He said, we would be looking at a macroscopic sessile predator with a sophisticated sensory system and a behavioral pattern unprecedented in the consortium's survey history. I said, that's one way to put it. He said, the consortium has surveyed 1,100 planetary bodies. In 40 years of personal research, I have never encountered. He paused. He looked at the image data again. He said, I would need to verify this independently before I could bring it to the expedition log. I said, that's fine. I'd recommend that while you verify it, we extend the camp perimeter sensor array to cover the full basin and recalibrate the detection threshold to 0.5 centimeters, and that we establish the no back-turning protocol across the full team, effective tonight. He said, those are significant operational changes. I said, yes. He looked at me. He said, you've been watching them every night. I said, yes. He said, since when? I said, since we landed. He was quiet again. Then he said he would review the data tonight and we would speak in the morning. I said, I'd prefer we speak before dark. He said, why? I said, because I counted 17 formations in the cluster nearest camp 11 nights ago, and this morning I counted 19. He sat back. All 4 of his primary arms rested on the lab table. It was the stillness of a man recalculating. I said, I'm not trying to cause a problem with your expedition. I'm telling you what I'm seeing. He said quietly, how fast? I said, at current rate of approach, assuming consistent increment size, and that the 2 additional formations represent the cluster's leading edge, I think we have between 22 and 28 days before they reach the perimeter. But that's assuming consistent behavior. I don't know if they accelerate. He stood up. He went to the tent entrance and looked out at the valley. The pale sun was 3 hours from the horizon. The formations were visible in the middle distance, gray against gray. He said, without turning around, have you been watching them alone this entire time? I said, yes. He said, you should have come to me sooner. I said, I needed the data first. He said, you were alone out there. I said, I had my lamp on. He turned around and looked at me. The amber eyes had the expression I had been waiting 11 days to see, the recalibration. The moment when a careful, intelligent person takes a significant piece of information and adjusts their entire model of the world around it. He said, we implement your protocol, starting now. I said, thank you. That evening, Dr. Orathveen called the full team together and explained the situation with the precision of a man who has spent his career communicating difficult findings to audiences who did not want to receive them. He showed them my data. He answered their questions. There were many, and they were good questions, because the Vaethori researchers were sharp people who had simply been operating under a wrong assumption. The questions ran through 2 hours of the evening, and I sat at the edge of the group and listened and said very little, because it was his briefing to run, and he was running it well. The protocol was established. No one turns their back on the valley. Movement within the camp perimeter is conducted facing outward. Habitat unit doors face away from the valley and are operated facing inward. The overnight observation shift, previously held by 1 junior researcher at a time, is doubled, 2 observers at all times, facing the valley. I took the midnight to dawn shift with a junior researcher named Velith Mar, who was 22 years old in Vaethori terms, which made her young, and who had the particular nervous energy of someone who has recently been told that a thing they thought was safe is not safe, and who is handling it by paying very close attention to everything. She was a fast learner, I liked her immediately. We sat in our chairs facing the valley, and she said, quietly on the first night, "How do you know to do this?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You knew when no one else did. You set up to watch them before you had any data. How did you know?" I said, "I didn't know, I suspected." She said, "Based on what?" I said, "Based on the shape, the bilateral projection pattern, the distribution, the way they were positioned relative to each other. There's a similar organism on my home planet. Different substrate, different movement mechanism, same behavioral principle." She said, "Same behavioral principle." She said it slowly, the way you repeat a thing when you're still working out what it means. I said, "They only move when nothing is watching them." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How does something evolve that?" I said, "The same way everything evolves anything. The ones that moved when watched got caught. The ones that only moved when nothing was looking didn't." She said, "Caught by what?" I said, "I don't know, something that was watching." She thought about that. We sat in the cold and watched the valley. She said, "What are they catching now? What do they eat?" I said, "I don't know yet. I have a theory." She said, "What is it?" I said, "Heat and light, and whatever generates both. And I think the mechanism might be a lot simpler than it looks. I think when they contact a heat source, they absorb it. I think that's what the mineralization pattern is. I think those fracture lines on the surface are absorption channels." She said, "That would make them." She stopped. I said, "Extremely dangerous to anything that generates heat and stops watching." She looked at the valley. She looked at me. She said, "How do you live next to them on your planet?" I said, "You learn the rules young." She said, "What are the rules?" I said, "You keep your light on. You keep your face toward them. You don't look away and you don't stop moving, and if you absolutely have to move past one, you go backwards so you're always facing it. And you don't go out alone at night." She said, "You've been out alone at night for 11 days. I said, "I had my lamp." She said very quietly, "That seems like a significant risk to take." I said, "It was a calculated risk. I needed independent data before I could make a case to Dr. Orethveen that would hold up to his scrutiny. Showing him one night's count and saying I had a feeling wasn't going to change the expedition protocol." She said, "You could have been wrong." I said, "Yes." She said, "But you weren't." I said, "No." We watched the valley. After a while she said, "Do you not get frightened?" I said, "I do. I was frightened the first night I sat out here and started counting. I was frightened when I counted 17 and then went back to my field notes and checked my count 3 times because I didn't want to believe it." She said, "But you kept sitting out here." I said, "Being frightened and doing the thing aren't mutually exclusive. I needed the data. I needed to be sure." She was quiet for a long time. The valley was dark and still, and the formations were invisible at this hour, which was the worst time. When you couldn't see them, you had to hold the count in your head. 19 in the nearest cluster. 47 logged formations across the accessible basin. The sensor array, recalibrated now, was showing its first anomalous readings, micro-movements, 0.3 to 0.6 centimeters, in 4 distinct formation locations. Always stopping when the sensor sweep covered their sector, always starting again in the intervals. She watched the sensor display. She said, "They know we're watching them." I said, "They know something is watching them. They're very good at detecting it." She said, "But not perfect." I said, "No, not perfect. That's the margin we're working with." The margin. I thought about that phrase for days afterward because it was the right word. Everything about living alongside the Watchers, the ones on Vale Prime, the ones here, was a matter of margin. The margin between the increment that triggered the sensor and the increment they chose to move. The margin between the distance you maintained and the distance at which they became dangerous. The margin between the observation interval and the time they needed to close it. We were not safer than the formations. We were only ahead of them in the margin. That was enough. That had always been enough. You just had to know it existed. The next morning, Dr. Orethveen presented the situation to the full team over the first meal and asked for recommendations on expedition continuation. The survey mission was 2/3 complete. They had significant data already, and the remaining third would require deeper penetration into the basin, closer to the primary formation clusters. There was a substantive discussion. Several of the junior researchers were in favor of immediate extraction. The risk profile had changed materially, they argued, and continuation with an unclassified macroscopic predator of unknown capability was not what they had signed on for. One of the senior researchers, a methodical woman named Dr. Prothosel, said that the data they had was insufficient to classify the organism, and that insufficient classification meant the planet would be logged as a question mark, which could mean another expedition in 5 years with less information than they had now, and that she was reluctant to leave a partially completed survey on the basis of a risk that was, as she put it, still theoretical. She was not wrong as a scientific matter. Dr. Orethveen listened to everyone. Then he asked me what I thought. I said, I think the survey can be completed safely if the protocol is maintained. The organisms respond to observation. That's the defense. Keep watching, keep your light on, keep your face toward the valley, and they don't close the distance. The margin in the sensor data is narrow, but it's consistent. They stop when something is looking at them. That's the rule. He said, You're confident in the rule. I said, I'm confident in the pattern. I've seen it hold for 11 days of overnight observation, and it matches the behavioral pattern of the analogous organism on my home planet, which my species has lived alongside for at least 300 years. He said, The analogous organism on your home planet. I said, Yes. He said, And your species learned to live with it. I said, We learned the rules. He said, Are those the same rules you've given us? I said, Yes. There was a silence. Then Dr. Prothosel said, with a scientist's precise acknowledgement of a changed situation, We have been fortunate. I said, Yes, we have. The next 10 days were different from the first 11. The research continued, but the team moved differently. The particular careful attention of people who have updated their model of the world and have not yet stopped noticing the update. The survey walks into the basin proceeded in pairs, always facing the formations, always moving in the way I had described, backing away from anything they needed to leave behind, maintaining visual contact, pausing at any moment when their attention had to split between instruments and surroundings to re-establish facing first. It was slower work. It was also, I thought, good work, the kind of care that comes from understanding what you're dealing with. I walked every survey with them. I carried no instruments. My job on those walks was to watch. There were moments during those 10 days when I saw the Vaethori researchers do a thing I recognized from my own childhood, the small automatic adjustment, the slight repositioning of the body that kept the face toward the valley even while the hands were doing something else. Sethik Path crouched to collect a soil sample, pivoting on one knee so his back never faced the basin. Dr. Prothosel comparing 2 spectroscope readings, turning the instrument so she was looking past it toward the formations rather than away. Small adjustments. They didn't have to think about them anymore after the first 3 days. The adjustment became reflex. That was the rule-taking route. That was how it worked. What impressed me, and I did not say this to any of them because it was not the kind of thing that fit naturally into expedition conversation, was how quickly they adapted once the model shifted. 3 days. From people who had never heard of the behavioral pattern to people whose bodies had incorporated the basic rule. That is, in my experience, faster than most. Vaethori researchers were not soldiers or field workers. They were academics who spent most of their professional lives in labs and transports, and catalogued the galaxy from a comfortable remove. The fact that they took the rules seriously, held it consistently, and passed from conscious compliance to automatic behavior in 72 hours told me something about the quality of the people in that team. I thought, watching Sethekpoth pivot on his knee for the 11th time that morning without thinking about it, that my grandmother would have liked this team. Dr. Orathveen asked me, on one of the survey walks, a question I had not expected. He asked how the absorption mechanism was thought to work, not the behavioral component, which he now understood thoroughly, but the physical mechanism, the fracture channels, how they transferred whatever they took from a heat source into the organism's mass. I said, we don't have a complete theory. The leading hypothesis is a thermal induction process through the fracture channel network. The channels have a composition that's extremely thermally conductive at one end and essentially resistant at the core. So when the outer surface contacts a heat source, the energy moves inward and distributes. We think the mass increase over time is the accumulated mineral byproduct of that process. They're converting heat into mineral structure. Growing. He said, 400,000 years of growth. I said, at the rate we've documented on Vale Prime, and assuming Karath 9 started from a similar baseline, you'd expect specimens significantly larger than what we're seeing here, which suggests either a much slower growth rate or periodic fragmentation events where larger formations split into smaller ones. He said, the smaller specimens at the valley edges. I said, yes, that's my thinking. He was quiet for a pace or two. Then he said, so the cluster isn't 15 organisms, it might be one that fragmented. I said, possibly, we don't know. He said, that would mean the behavioral coordination we're observing, the subthreshold advances, the cluster edge approaching while the main body holds. That could be one distributed organism rather than 15 independent ones responding similarly. I said, that would change the classification significantly. He said, yes, it would. We walked on, facing the basin, and I thought about that on several subsequent nights. The possibility that what I had been watching for 20+ days was not a group, but a single thing, distributed across the valley in fragments, all of them part of one patient network of mineral and heat hunger, 400,000 years old and still moving toward the warmth. On the 17th day, one of the junior researchers, a young man named Kethvarin, assigned to acoustic measurement, was 50 meters into the basin with Dr. Orathveen when his instrument began producing an anomalous reading that required him to crouch and adjust a recalibration interface on its underside. To do this, he had to turn the instrument around. He did it instinctively, the way you do any habitual task, and as he turned the instrument, he turned his body with it, and for 4 seconds he was facing the camp rather than the basin. Dr. Orathveen called his name, sharp and flat. Kethvarin turned back immediately. The formation that had been 12 meters to his left was 8 meters to his left. 4 meters, 4 seconds. Dr. Orathveen very calmly said, face it. Don't move, just face it. Kethvarin faced it. He was shaking. I could see it from 40 meters away. The formation was a mid-height specimen, maybe 5 meters, with the bilateral projection and the fracture channels and the absolute stillness of something that has stopped and is waiting. It was 8 meters from him. It did not look like a geological feature. Dr. Orathveen said, step back, 1 step at a time, face toward it. Kethvarin stepped back, 1 step, then another. The formation did not move. He backed up until he was beside Dr. Orathveen, and they came back to camp together, both of them facing the basin the entire way. When they reached the perimeter, Kethvarin sat down on a supply case and put his head between his knees. Dr. Orathveen stood at the perimeter and looked at the place where the formation had been, and had briefly been somewhere else. He came and found me at the observation post. He stood beside me for a while. Then he said, 1 meter per second. I said, give or take. He said, it covered 4 meters in 4 seconds. I said, that's consistent with what I've seen in the sensor data. They're not fast. They don't need to be. They're patient. He said, 400,000 years. I said, at least. He was quiet. Then he said, how close did it come to him? I said, 8 meters when he turned back. The safe threshold for solo contact is generally 10, based on the Earth records. He was lucky. He said, the Earth records. I said, my species has documentation going back 3 centuries on the behavior parameters of the analogous organism. Minimum safe observation distance, rate of approach under non-observation, time to halt under re-observation. The numbers translate within about 15% to what I'm seeing here. He said, you used those numbers to calculate your own overnight exposure margins. I said, yes. He said, alone for 11 days. I said I had my lamp. He said, very quietly, you know that if you had told me this at the start. I said, you would have asked for data and I wouldn't have had any. The manifest said they were inert. You done the pre-survey monitoring. I had a feeling and a pattern recognition and a grandmother's old rule. That's not enough to change an expedition protocol. He said, it was enough for you. I said I was raised with it. You weren't. There's a difference. He looked at me. He said, I want to hear about the analogous organism. Tonight, the full history, not just the numbers. I said, all right. That night, after the briefing and after the protocols were reinforced, and after Vaethori had eaten something warm and gone to his habitat unit with a lamp that would stay on until sunrise, Dr. Orethveen sat down across from me at the observation post, and I told him about the valley behind my grandmother's house on Vale Prime, and the stones with the bilateral symmetry, and the way the village had learned to live beside them across 300 years of careful observation and 1 generation's worth of hard lessons. I told him about the fracture channels and what we thought the absorption mechanism was. I told him about the oldest standing rule, you keep your light on, you keep your face toward them, you never stop watching, and where that rule came from, which was from the generation that didn't have it. He listened the way careful scientists listen. He asked questions. When I was done, he was quiet for a while, and then he said, your species classifies Vale Prime as a Class 17 death world. I said we did, yes. He said, and you grew up there. I said, in the valley. He said, next to the Watcher formations. I said, my grandmother called them that. I don't know what the official survey designation would be. I don't think anyone's officially surveyed them. He said, why not? I said, because the people who live there know the rules, and the rules work, and sending an official survey team would mean a group of people who don't know the rules walking into the valley, with the certainty that they're looking at an inert geological feature. He was quiet. He said, like us. I said, like you initially, yes. He said, and you came on this expedition knowing the risk. I said, I came on this expedition because I saw the survey manifest and recognized the description. I thought it was possible the same organism or a related variant was present. I wanted to be on site if it was. He said, you wanted to be on site for an organism that kills people who look away from it. I said I knew the rules. I was more useful here than not here. He said, that is a very cold way to evaluate your own risk. I said, it's the only way that makes sense. He looked out at the valley. The sensor array was showing its micro-movement signals, the fine incremental advances in the dark. The lamps around the camp perimeter were all on. The 2 overnight observers were at their posts, facing out. He said, what do they look like, the ones on your planet? I said, the same, exactly the same as far as I can tell, that bilateral projection, the fracture channels, the absolute stillness. He said, 400,000 years here. Do you know how old the ones on your planet are? I said, we don't have a good estimate. The mineralization makes dating difficult. He said, no, I suppose it would. We watched the valley together for a while. At one point he said, "The rate of movement. Do they accelerate when they haven't been observed for a long time?" I said, "Yes. The Earth data suggests an exponential relationship. The longer the unobserved interval, the faster the subsequent approach rate. We think it's something to do with the energy budget. They can move quickly, they just can't sustain it." He said, "How quickly?" I said, "The Earth record has one documented case of a 3-meter specimen covering 11 meters in under 2 seconds. The observer had been away for 9 days." He said nothing. I said, "The observer survived. She ran." He said, "She ran backwards, I presume." I said, "Yes, it was her grandmother's rule." He said, "These rules are," he paused, "these rules are old." I said, "Very old." He said, "And yet your species kept them." I said, "The ones who didn't keep them left fewer grandchildren." He was quiet a long time after that. The last 5 days of the survey were the most careful of my professional life, which is saying something given the professional life I've had. The team had what they needed from the basin floor. Dr. Orethveen made the call on day 21 that the scientific objectives were substantively complete, and that the remaining collection would put the team at unnecessarily elevated risk, given the formation density in the unexplored western quadrant. He said this without drama, the way a scientist announces a conclusion he has worked through to its logical end. The formation count in the nearest cluster was 24. That cluster had been at 600 meters when I started counting. It was now at 210. The sensor array was showing consistent movement across 9 distinct formation locations during its 30-second intersweep intervals. Not fast movement, patient movement. 30-second intervals, and they were using every second of them. On the last night before extraction, I did my final overnight observation with Vaethori. The sensor data was clear, the lamps were on, and the nearest formation in the cluster was approximately 200 meters out. In daylight, you could see it clearly, a tall one, nearly 7 meters, the bilateral projections wide and the fracture channels deep, and absolutely still whenever anyone was looking at it. Vaethori said, "How long would it take, from 200 meters?" I said, "At standard approach rate, maybe 3.5 minutes of unobserved time, to reach someone standing still at the perimeter." She said, "You've been calculating this the whole time." I said, "It's useful to know." She said, "You seem very calm about it." I said, "I've been calm about it my whole life. I grew up next to them." She said, "Does that ever stop being strange?" I said, "You get used to anything if you grow up with it." She said, "I don't think I would get used to this." I said, "Maybe not. But if you'd grown up with it, you'd know the rules the way you know to breathe. You wouldn't think about it any more than you think about breathing." She said, "It seems like you think about it quite a lot." I said, "I think about it when I'm near them. When I'm home, on Vale Prime, walking past the valley, I don't think about it. I just face them, same as I face a door when I open it." She was quiet. Then she said, "What happens if someone closes their eyes, by accident, a blink?" I said, "A blink is fine. The response threshold seems to require several seconds of continuous non-observation. A blink isn't enough to trigger approach." She said, "You're sure?" I said, 3 centuries of data, yes." She said, "Good, because I've been trying not to blink for the last 2 hours and I'm starting to see things." I said, "Blink normally, just keep facing them." She blinked. We sat in the lamplight and watched the dark valley and the sensor display, and the formations held their positions because we were watching them, and the night passed. The extraction was the last thing, and it needed to go right. Dr. Orethveen had planned it carefully. The equipment breakdown was done over 2 days while surveys continued, shrinking the camp footprint incrementally, moving the packed cases toward the landing pad at the eastern edge of the camp in stages while maintaining full observation protocols. The shuttle was called in on the morning of day 26. It would land, we would load, and we would leave. The problem was the camp breakdown. By the morning of extraction, we had 6 people remaining. Keth Varan had been medevac 2 days earlier on Dr. Orethvine's order, his stress response indicators having reached a threshold where Vaethori medical protocol required intervention. That left Dr. Orethvine, Dr. Prothosal, 2 junior researchers named Leth Vath and Sethik Path, Velith Mar, and me. 6 people. 3 packed supply crates, the remaining instrument cases, and 2 generator units still standing at the camp perimeter. The nearest formation cluster was at 140 meters. It had moved 60 meters while we were breaking down camp. I called everyone to the central area and said, "Here is how we do this. 4 of you face the valley, 2 at a time in rotation. The other 2 pack and move cases. Nobody turns their back on the valley at any point, and nobody moves equipment in a direction that requires them to face away from it. The generators have to come down last because they're the biggest heat sources. Take them down simultaneously, quickly, and as soon as they're off, get to the pad. The shuttle will land at the eastern edge of the camp. We walk to it facing the valley the whole way." Dr. Orethvine said, "You'll organize this?" I said yes. He stepped back. The 2 remaining senior researchers stepped back. I looked at the junior researchers and Velith Mar, and they were all paying attention with the focused clarity of people who understand exactly what is at stake. We worked for 2 hours. It was not fast work, moving supply crates and instrument cases while facing outward, shuffling backward across 40 meters of camp, requires a particular kind of coordinated awkward movement that none of us were graceful at. But it worked. Crate by crate, case by case, the camp footprint shrank toward the landing pad. Nobody said much. Sethik Path hummed something low and rhythmic under his breath for a while, which I think was involuntary. The gray light was flat and cool, and the formations stood in their silent cluster at the edge of the basin and did not move, because we were watching them, and they knew it. At the hour and 40-minute mark, I counted the nearest cluster again. 112 meters. 28 meters in 2 hours. The pace was increasing. I said without raising my voice, "We need to move faster." They moved faster. The shuttle came in at the 2-hour mark, landing with the particular clean hydraulic sound of a consortium transport setting down, and the loading ramp extended toward us. I positioned myself between the team and the valley while Dr. Prothosal and Leth Vath loaded the last of the equipment cases. Sethik Path had one of the generator units disconnected and was carrying it, awkwardly, backward, all 6 limbs occupied, still facing the valley. Velith Mar had the second generator. The leading formation in the nearest cluster was at 91 meters. I said, "Generators down, now." They set them down. The power cut. The hum I'd been feeling in my back teeth for 26 days went silent. I said, "Everyone on the ramp, move now." Dr. Orethvine was the last one besides me. He backed up the ramp facing the valley, and I held my position at the ramp's base watching the nearest formation until he was clear, and then I walked up the ramp backward and Sethik Path hit the ramp controls from inside and it retracted and the shuttle door sealed. For 4 seconds while the door sealed, none of us were watching the valley. The shuttle lifted. Through the forward observation port, as we rose above the gray basin, I could see the formation cluster. The nearest formation, the one that had been at 91 meters when the generators cut, was at the landing pad. The exact spot where I had been standing. Dr. Orethvine stood beside me at the observation port. He watched the formation on the landing pad until it was too small to see. Then he said, very quietly, "How long were we not watching?" I said 4 seconds. He said, "It covered 91 meters." I said 22 meters per second. In 4 seconds, yes. He was quiet. I said, "It stopped when we were through the door." He said, "It stopped when the door sealed." I said, "The door has a viewport." He looked at the viewport in the shuttle door. It was a small circular thing, scratched and clouded at the edges. He said, "You'd positioned yourself at the bottom of the ramp, so the door viewport would be the last point of observation." I said, "Yes." He sat down. He put 2 of his 4 primary arms over his eyes in the gesture that served his species as the equivalent of a long exhaled breath. He sat that way for a while. The shuttle broke atmosphere 12 minutes later. The gray plane and the gray formations in the landing pad fell away behind us and became a gray planet, and then a point of light, and then nothing. I watched it until I couldn't see it anymore, which is a habit, and then I turned around and found a seat. The debrief took 3 weeks, standard consortium procedure after a survey that resulted in a species reclassification. I sat through 47 hours of recorded testimony. I submitted my field notes, my image archive analysis, my sensor data interpretations, and a 12-page report on the behavioral parameters of the Kareth-9 formations as compared to the analogous organisms documented in the Earth records on Vale Prime. Dr. Orathveen submitted his own testimony separately, and it corroborated mine in every technical particular, which he did not have to do and which I appreciated. At the end of the debrief, the Vaethori Research Consortium's classification board formally reclassified Kareth-9 as a Class 19 active macroscopic predator environment, pending further study. They also issued a general survey advisory to all member species operating in the system, which recommended that no survey teams be sent to the planetary surface without a human liaison present and briefed on the behavioral protocols. A human liaison, not a xenobiologist with watcher-organism training, not someone with the specific experiential knowledge that had kept 6 people alive. A human, broadly, because we were the ones who had the rules and had kept them, and had the data going back 300 years to prove the rules worked. I signed the classification form. I signed the advisory acknowledgement. I signed the debrief completion certificate. The clerk who processed the paperwork was a young Vaethori administrative staff member who had clearly been briefed on the incident but not on the details, because he looked at my signature and looked at my file and said, with the careful neutrality of someone trying not to ask the obvious question, "It says here you were the only human on the survey team." I said, "That's right." He said, "And you were there for the full 26 days." I said, "Yes." He looked at my file for a moment. Then he said, because he couldn't quite help it, "Wasn't that frightening?" I said, "Yes." He said, "But you stayed." I said, "I had my lamp on." He processed the paperwork. He stamped the forms. He gave me my copies. As I was leaving, he said very quietly, the way you say something you've been working up to, he said, "The organisms on your home planet, the Watchers, you grew up next to them." I said, "Yes." He said, "Do they ever stop? Do you ever reach a point where you just don't have to worry about them anymore?" I thought about my grandmother's house. I thought about the valley in the morning light, the stones still because the whole village was facing them, the way everyone knew when they went out the door to put their back to the house and their face to the valley. I thought about the rule and how old it was, and how it had come down through 3 centuries of careful people who had understood what lived in that valley and had chosen to stay anyway, because the land was good and the rule was learnable, and the things in the valley were patient but not clever. I said, "You don't stop worrying. You learn to worry correctly." He looked at me. I picked up my copies of the paperwork and walked out. The transit home was 14 days. I spent most of it at the observation port, watching the stars, which don't move when you watch them and don't move when you don't, which I found restful. On the last day, I got out my field journal and added a final note to the Kareth-9 entry. A summary line, the kind you write not for the record but for yourself, for the version of yourself 5 years from now who will open the journal and read it and remember. I wrote 26 days, 6 survivors, the rule held. Then I closed the journal and watched the stars until we docked. I have been asked in the years since what I think about the Careth 9 formations, whether I think they're dangerous, whether I think the survey advisory is enough, whether I think the galaxy is ready for what Careth 9 represents, which is not an anomaly but a data point. One more entry in a very long list of things that Earth's biology has spent its history alongside and learning and surviving. Things that the wider galaxy classified as inert or impossible or academic interest only right up until the moment they weren't. I say, the formations are exactly as dangerous as anything is when you don't know the rules. And they're manageable if you know the rules and keep your lamp on and don't look away. I say, the survey advisory is a start. I say, yes, I think they'll be ready, or they'll become ready. The same way my grandmother's village became ready, through careful people paying careful attention over a long time, and handing down what they learned to the next person, and the person after that. I say all of this honestly, which is my habit. What I don't say, because it's not the kind of thing that fits into a debrief or a classification form or an advisory document, is this. On the night when the nearest formation was at 200 meters, and Vilithmar asked me if I ever stopped finding it strange, I looked out at that gray valley with the pale lamps burning, and the sensor display showing its fine patient increments, and I thought about my grandmother sitting in her chair beside the window that faced the valley, watching, every night with her lamp on. She did it her whole life. She never had a night when the rule failed her. That's what I thought about in the cold, on a planet 40 light-years from home, with a stone thing 200 meters away that would come for me the moment I stopped looking. I thought the rule is 300 years old. And I kept my lamp on. And I did not look away.